Tonight, we journey to a place both beautiful and brutal. A land of mist-shrouded mountains, delicate cherry blossoms, and the constant whisper of an earth that shifts beneath your feet. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking in ancient Japan. Not the Japan of Hollywood imagination, with elegant geisha and noble samurai performing choreographed sword dances. Number, the real Japan. The one where a single earthquake could swallow your village whole. Where disease swept through settlements like wildfire every generation. Where hunger was not an occasional visitor, but a permanent shadow across the land. You open your eyes to darkness. It is before dawn, as it always must be, because the day's work cannot wait for sunlight. The air is cold and damp. Your body aches from yesterday's labor and will ache again from today's. There is no coffee to ease you into consciousness, no toothpaste to freshen your mouth, no shower to wash away the grime. There is only work and survival, and the eternal question that follows you like a hungry ghost. Will I make it through another day? The truth we must confront gently but honestly is this. You would not last, not a day, perhaps not even hours. Not because you lack courage or intelligence, but because survival in ancient Japan required a kind of hardness, a tolerance for suffering that our modern bodies and minds simply cannot comprehend. We have been softened by convenience, by medicine, by the promise that tomorrow will come. They had no such promise. When we speak of ancient Japan, we are speaking of a vast sweep of time, from the Jomon Period, beginning around 14,000 years before the Common Era, through the Yayoi period starting around 300 BCE, into the classical Heian period from 794 to 1185 CE, and the beginning of the warrior age with the Kamakura period from 1185 to 1333. Across these millennia, the daily experience of life shifted and evolved. But certain fundamental truths remained. Life was short, it was often painful, and it ended, frequently, without warning. The Japanese archipelago consists of 4 main islands and thousands of smaller ones, stretching across nearly 2,000 miles of ocean. It is a place of extraordinary beauty and terrible violence. Mountains dominate the landscape. Even today, only about 15% of the land is suitable for agriculture, a constraint that shaped settlement patterns and food production throughout Japanese history. Rivers carved through volcanic stone, creating valleys where rice could be grown. But these same valleys became death traps when typhoons brought flooding rains. The surrounding seas provided fish and seaweed, sustenance that kept millions alive. But they also delivered tsunamis and storms that could erase entire coastal communities in minutes. Everything in ancient Japan existed on the edge of catastrophe. This geographical reality shaped not just where people lived and how they built their homes, but how they thought about life itself, the impermanence of all things. A central concept in Buddhist philosophy was not merely an abstract spiritual teaching. It was lived experience. The ground beneath your feet could betray you at any moment. The sky could darken with typhoon winds. The peaceful mountain on the horizon could explode with volcanic fury. In such a world, the idea that you might plan for a future beyond the next harvest season was almost absurd. And yet, people did survive. For thousands of years, generation after generation adapted, endured, and passed on their knowledge to their children. They developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, complex spiritual practices, refined artistic traditions, and social structures that balance the needs of individuals against the survival requirements of communities. They were, in their own way, brilliant. But brilliance does not make life easy. It only makes life possible. So let us begin this journey together. We will walk through the daily reality of ancient Japan, period by period, examining what it took to survive. We will look at the food you would eat, the diseases you would face, the work you would perform, the dangers you would navigate. We will see how people bathed, how they clothed themselves, how they understood their world. And through it all, we will ask ourselves honestly whether we, products of the modern age, could have endured what they endured. The answer, I suspect, will humble us. But that is as it should be. Humility in the face of our ancestors' struggles is the beginning of wisdom. Shall we continue? The ancient landscape, geography, and the dance with disaster. The Japanese archipelago sits at the intersection of four tectonic plates. The Pacific Plate pushes beneath the Eurasian Plate from the east. The Philippine Sea Plate slides under from the south. The North American Plate presses from the north. This meeting of giant crustal fragments, this slow-motion collision that has been occurring for millions of years, creates what geologists call a subduction zone. What it creates for the people living above is a life of constant low-level terror. Earthquakes in ancient Japan were not occasional events. They were woven into the fabric of daily existence. Small tremors that made lamps swing and water ripple in buckets happened multiple times per month. Moderate quakes that cracked walls and sent people running into open spaces occurred several times per year. And major earthquakes, the kind that could level cities and kill thousands, arrived with a regularity that made planning for the distant future seem almost pointless. Historical records, when they exist at all, tend to undercount earthquakes. Record keeping in ancient Japan was limited by several practical factors. Few people possessed the literacy skills necessary to maintain written chronicles. Documentation efforts focused primarily on events in the capital and major centers, leaving provincial disasters largely unrecorded. The chroniclers who did maintain records were often more concerned with court politics, religious matters, and dynastic succession than with natural phenomena that, however devastating to those who experienced them, seemed routine in a land where the earth shook constantly. The earliest major compilation of disaster history in Japan dates to 892 CE, when the scholar and government official Michizane Sugawara compiled records from 6 national history books. Among the 632 earthquakes he documented for the period from 416 to 887 CE, only 23 were classified as truly destructive. This represents a dramatic undercount when we consider modern seismological understanding. Japan experiences, on average, 1 magnitude 7 earthquake each year. Over the 471-year period Sugawara examined, hundreds of major earthquakes must have occurred, yet only a tiny fraction made it into the historical record. We must understand this underreporting in context. Many earthquakes happened in remote regions where no literate observers existed to record them. Others occurred in times of political instability, when record-keeping itself broke down. Some may have been deliberately minimized in official chronicles, as natural disasters could be interpreted as inauspicious omens. Though Japan's conception of imperial authority, unlike China's mandate of heaven, viewed the emperor's divine status as absolute and unconditional rather than dependent on heaven's approval. Most fundamentally, earthquakes were simply so common that only the most catastrophic merited special documentation. Modern seismologists estimate that Japan experiences 1 magnitude 7 earthquake on average every single year. In the ancient period, without the benefit of earthquake-resistant construction techniques, even a magnitude 6 quake could be catastrophic. Traditional Japanese homes were built of wood with paper walls and thatched roofs, materials chosen in part because they were relatively lightweight. When the ground shook violently, a wooden frame house might sway and survive, whereas a heavy stone structure would likely collapse. But survival came with its own costs. Fires ignited easily in these wooden structures, and because houses were built close together in villages and towns, a single fire could spread rapidly, especially when earthquake damage disrupted the water supply needed to fight the flames. Picture yourself lying on a thin mat in a wooden house in the middle of the night. The ground begins to rumble. At first, it might be subtle enough that you think you're imagining it. Then the rumbling grows. Objects begin to rattle. The beams of your house creak and groan. You know you should run outside, but darkness surrounds you, and in your disorientation, you cannot remember which direction leads to the door. The shaking intensifies. You are thrown to the floor. The sounds are overwhelming, a deep bass roar from the earth itself, mixed with the sharp cracks of splitting wood and the crashes of falling objects. Dust and debris fill the air. You cannot breathe. You cannot think. You can only endure, powerless, while the earth decides whether you will live or die. And then, as suddenly as it began, the shaking stops. You are alive. But you cannot know if another, larger shock will follow. You cannot know if your house will collapse in an aftershock. You cannot know if fire has started somewhere in the village and is even now racing toward your home. All you can do is gather your family in the open air and wait, trembling for dawn. This was not a rare experience. This was life. The psychological toll of living with constant earthquake threat cannot be overstated. In later periods of Japanese history, popular religion developed elaborate rituals and folk beliefs around earthquake prevention. Namazu, the giant catfish said to live beneath the Japanese islands, became a focus of prayers and offerings. When Namazu thrashed, people believed, the earth shook, shrines were built, amulets were purchased. But in the ancient period, before these folk traditions fully crystallized, people had fewer psychological coping mechanisms. They simply lived with fear as a permanent companion. Earthquakes brought other terrors in their wake. The same tectonic forces that caused the ground to shake also meant Japan was home to over 100 active volcanoes, representing roughly 10% of all active volcanoes in the world. Mount Fuji, now a beloved symbol of Japanese natural beauty, was greatly feared in the ancient and medieval periods. The mountain last erupted in 1707, showering the city of Edo, modern Tokyo, with a thick layer of volcanic ash. But popular culture and art of the period rarely depicted this eruption. Artists continued to paint Fuji as serene and majestic, as if the violent explosion had never occurred. This cultural amnesia was partly aesthetic preference, but also partly the same political suppression that kept earthquake documentation scarce. Other volcanoes were more consistently active. Sakurajima, on the southern island of Kyushu, erupts several hundred times each year, even in modern times. In the ancient period, before volcanologists could predict eruptions, living near an active volcano meant constant vigilance. The sky could darken without warning. Ash could rain down, killing crops, poisoning water supplies, and causing respiratory illness. Pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas and volcanic debris could race down mountainsides faster than any person could run, incinerating everything in their path. Lava could flow for miles, destroying forests and fields and villages with impartial, unstoppable force. If the earth beneath and the mountains around you were not threat enough, the ocean offered its own dangers. Tsunamis, a word borrowed into English directly from Japanese, were a recurring nightmare for coastal communities. When a major earthquake occurred beneath the ocean floor, as frequently happened along Japan's subduction zones, the displaced water generated waves that could travel across hundreds of miles of open ocean before striking the coast with devastating power. These were not the towering walls of water often depicted in disaster films, at least not in the open sea. But as the waves approached shallow coastal waters, they compressed and rose, transforming into surges of water that could reach heights of 10, 20, even 30 meters. Such waves did not merely wash over the land, they destroyed it utterly, sweeping away buildings, trees, and people with equal ease. Historical records describe tsunamis erasing entire villages. In regions that suffered repeated tsunami strikes, some communities adapted by building on higher ground or constructing warning systems using bell towers that could be heard for miles. But many coastal settlements, dependent on fishing for their survival, could not abandon proximity to the sea. They rebuilt after each disaster, knowing that another tsunami would come eventually, accepting this as the price of life in Japan. Typhoons added yet another dimension to the constant threat of natural disaster. These massive tropical cyclones formed over the warm waters of the Pacific Ocean and regularly tracked northwest toward the Japanese archipelago, typically between July and October. The word kamikaze, now associated with wartime pilots, originally meant divine wind. referring to the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281. While those particular storms were celebrated as evidence of divine protection, most typhoons brought nothing but suffering. A typhoon could bring winds powerful enough to strip the thatch from roofs, snap trees like kindling, and hurl debris through the air with lethal velocity. But more dangerous than the wind was the rain. Typhoons could dump months' worth of precipitation in a matter of days, overwhelming rivers, flooding rice paddies, and triggering massive landslides on the steep, deforested slopes of Japan's mountains. Flash floods could appear with terrifying speed, transforming peaceful streams into raging torrents that destroyed everything in their path. In a world without weather satellites or modern meteorology, typhoons arrived with little warning. Experienced fishermen and farmers could read signs in the behavior of birds, the quality of the sky, the feel of the wind. But these predictions were imprecise at best. Sometimes a typhoon that seemed to be tracking toward the coastline would veer away at the last moment, sparing a region. Other times, a storm that appeared distant would suddenly intensify and strike with unexpected ferocity. There was no reliable way to know. Living in Japan meant living with this uncertainty. It meant understanding that no matter how carefully you planned, no matter how hard you worked, natural forces beyond your control or comprehension could destroy everything in moments. This shaped not just the physical infrastructure of life, the building techniques and agricultural practices, but also the spiritual and philosophical frameworks people used to make sense of their existence. Buddhism's emphasis on impermanence and non-attachment was not merely theological abstraction. It was practical wisdom for a population that needed ways to cope with loss that came again and again without reason or justice. The climate itself was both blessing and curse. Japan's position in the northern Pacific gave it 4 distinct seasons, with variations between regions. The archipelago stretches from subtropical to subarctic climates. But most of the population in ancient times lived in the temperate central regions where rice agriculture was viable. These areas enjoyed warm, humid summers ideal for growing rice, but also endured periods of intense heat that could be deadly, particularly for the elderly, the very young, and those weakened by malnutrition or disease. Winters in much of Japan were cold, but not bitterly so compared to northern China or Korea. Snow fell in many regions, particularly on the Sea of Japan coast, where winter winds picked up moisture from the sea and deposited it as heavy, wet snow that could accumulate to great depths. This snow was both a blessing and a curse. It provided water for agriculture when it melted in spring, but it also made travel nearly impossible for months at a time and could collapse buildings if the load became too heavy. The rainy season, the Bayou or plum rains, came each year in early summer, bringing weeks of constant, depressing drizzle. This moisture was essential for rice cultivation, as paddies needed to be flooded for much of the growing season. But too much rain at the wrong time could be disastrous, drowning seedlings or preventing harvest. And the humidity that came with the rain created ideal conditions for disease and parasites. In this environment, this landscape of beauty and terror, people built their lives. They farmed the narrow valleys. They fished the dangerous seas. They cut trees from the mountainsides for fuel and timber, inadvertently increasing landslide risk. They prayed to spirits in rivers and mountains, to Buddhist deities and Shinto kami, asking for protection from forces they could not control. Sometimes those prayers seemed to be answered. More often, they were not. And always, they knew that the next disaster was coming. They did not know when. They did not know what form it would take, but they knew it would come. This knowledge was in the bones of every person who lived in ancient Japan. It was passed from parent to child, a terrible inheritance. Survival is not guaranteed. Life is fragile. The earth is not stable. The sky is not safe. These were the first lessons every child learned, often before they learned to walk. Could you live with that? Could you raise children in that environment, knowing you might watch them die in an earthquake, a tsunami, a typhoon, a famine that follows crop failure caused by volcanic ash? Could you rebuild your life again and again after disaster destroyed everything you had worked for? The people of ancient Japan did. They had no choice. But we, coming from our world of weather forecasts and building codes and disaster relief, we have never developed that particular kind of strength that comes from enduring the unendurable, because there is no alternative. Prehistoric Japan, the Jomon Period. Long before rice cultivation, before written language, before complex social hierarchies and political structures, there were the Jomon people. Their era spans an almost incomprehensible length of time, from approximately 14,000 BC to 300 BCE. To put this in perspective, the Jomon culture existed for longer than all of recorded human history since. During this vast sweep of millennia, ice ages ended, sea levels rose and fell, and the Japanese islands gradually took the shape we recognize today. The name Jomon, meaning cord-marked, refers to the distinctive rope pattern decorations these people pressed into their pottery. This pottery is among the oldest in the world, predating ceramics found anywhere else by roughly 2,000 years. The fact that pottery emerged among hunter-gatherer populations rather than agricultural societies as happened elsewhere tells us something important about Jomon culture. These were not simple nomadic tribes scraping out a bare existence. They were sophisticated people with rich spiritual lives, complex social organization, and remarkable artistic traditions. Life in the Jomon period was built around the rhythms of the natural world. People lived in small settlements, typically consisting of 5 to 10 pit dwellings arranged in roughly circular patterns. These dwellings were semi-subterranean, with floors dug about half a meter into the earth. Wooden posts supported thatched roofs that extended down nearly to ground level, creating a low-profile structure that offered protection from wind and helped retain heat during winter months. A hearth in the center provided warmth and light and a place to cook food. The entrance faced away from prevailing winds. Inside these dwellings, space was limited and dark. Adults could not stand upright in most areas. Smoke from the fire gradually escaped through gaps in the thatch, but much of it lingered inside, creating a hazy, eye-irritating atmosphere. The floor was bare earth, cold and often damp. Sleeping arrangements consisted of animal hides or woven plant material laid directly on the ground. Privacy was impossible. In winter, when families spent most of their time indoors to escape the cold, the cramped conditions must have been particularly challenging. The Jomon people were hunter-gatherers, but this term barely captures the complexity and skill required for their way of life. They hunted deer and wild boar using spears, bows and arrows, and traps. They fished rivers and coastal waters using hooks made from bone, nets woven from plant fibers, and weirs constructed across streams. They gathered an enormous variety of wild plant foods, particularly nuts like chestnuts, walnuts, horse chestnuts, and acorns. They collected edible roots, wild vegetables, berries, and mushrooms. They harvested shellfish from coastal areas and seaweed from the shallows. This might sound romantic, a life lived in harmony with nature, but the reality was exhausting and uncertain. Hunting required tremendous skill and patience. Deer and boar were wary prey. Successful hunts might happen only a few times per month, and the entire community would need to participate in the butchering and processing of the animal to avoid waste. Nothing could be discarded. Meat was eaten, of course, but bones were fashioned into tools and needles. Hides were scraped and treated for clothing and shelter. Sinew became cordage. Even organs and intestines were consumed or used. Gathering was slightly more reliable than hunting, but it too required extensive knowledge. A person needed to know which plants were edible and which were toxic. They needed to understand when different foods became available throughout the year, where to find them, and how to process them. Acorns, for example, were a staple food in many Jomon communities, but raw acorns contain bitter tannins that must be leached out before the nuts are edible. This required crushing the acorns, soaking them in flowing water for days, then drying and grinding them into flour. The process was labor-intensive, but it transformed a widely available wild food into a storable, calorie-dense resource that could sustain communities through winter. Chestnuts were so important to Jomon culture that people actively managed chestnut groves, essentially practicing a form of proto-agriculture thousands of years before rice farming arrived. They would thin competing vegetation, protecting chestnut trees and encouraging their growth. Archaeological evidence shows that chestnut wood was used extensively for building posts and for crafting various tools and containers. The trees provided both food and materials, making them invaluable. Despite their sophisticated resource management, the Jomon people lived on the edge of subsistence. Food security was never guaranteed. A bad year for the chestnut harvest, an unusually harsh winter that killed game animals, a shift in ocean currents that drove fish away from traditional fishing grounds. Any of these could mean starvation. Evidence from skeletal remains shows that nutritional stress was common. Many individuals experienced periods of severe malnutrition during childhood, visible in their adult bones as lines and marks that recorded times when growth was disrupted by lack of food. The average height of Jomon people was approximately 157 centimeters for men and 147 centimeters for women. By modern standards, they were quite short, though this was typical for prehistoric populations worldwide. They had muscular builds, a necessity given the physical demands of their lifestyle. Facial features included double eyelids, sculptured faces, and relatively thick lips. Their teeth show evidence of significant wear, unsurprising given a diet that included many hard, coarse foods. Cavities were present in many individuals, indicating that starchy foods, particularly processed acorns and chestnuts, formed a major part of the diet. Perhaps most telling, excavations of Jomon sites have uncovered enormous numbers of whipworm parasite eggs. These intestinal parasites caused chronic abdominal pain, diarrhea, and anemia. In severe infections, particularly in children, whipworms could be fatal. The prevalence of these parasites suggests that sanitation was rudimentary at best, and that contamination of food and water with human waste was common. This is not a criticism of Jomon people. They lacked the biological understanding necessary to connect parasites with disease. They lived in close quarters, in conditions that modern epidemiologists would recognize as ideal for parasite transmission. Life expectancy was short. Infant and child mortality rates were extremely high, perhaps claiming half of all children before their 5th birthday. Infections, accidents, parasites, malnutrition all took their toll. Those who survived childhood faced additional dangers. Childbirth was perilous for women. Hunting accidents claimed men. Injuries that might be minor annoyances in the modern world, a broken bone, a deep cut, could become fatal if infections set in. Death was a constant presence. The Jomon people buried their dead in pit graves, often within or very near settlements. Adults were typically buried in rows during the early to middle Jomon periods. Later, burial practices shifted, with graves sometimes built in the settlement center or in separate cemeteries away from living areas. Dead children were often buried in pottery vessels, perhaps as a way of protecting their small bodies or symbolizing a return to the womb. These burial practices reveal something important about Jomon culture. They cared for their dead. They treated bodies with respect. Grave goods, including pottery, stone tools, and personal ornaments, accompanied the deceased. This suggests belief in some form of afterlife or spirit world, though we can only speculate about the specific nature of their religious beliefs. What we can say with certainty is that death was not hidden away or denied. It was integrated into daily life, physically and symbolically. The spiritual world of the Jomon people found expression in their remarkable pottery and in the creation of dogu, small clay figurines. These figurines, which appear from the earliest stages of the Jomon period and increase in sophistication and number over time, are among the most distinctive artifacts of the culture. Most dogu are clearly female, and many depict pregnant women or women in late stages of pregnancy. The famous Jomon Venus figurine, designated as a national treasure of Japan and excavated from the Tanabatake archaeological site in Nagano, shows a heavily pregnant woman with exaggerated features. Based on their form and archaeological context, researchers interpret these figurines as having served roles in practices related to fertility, healing, and the life force represented by women's ability to bear children. In a world out, where infant mortality was high, and where the survival of the community depended on maintaining population numbers, fertility would have been of paramount concern. The figurines could have been used in rituals to ensure safe childbirth, to heal illnesses, or to increase the productivity of the land itself. Some show evidence of intentional breaking, which suggests they may have been destroyed as part of ritual practices, possibly to release spiritual power, or to transfer illness from a person into the figurine, though the exact meaning of this practice remains uncertain. The Jomon people's relationship with the natural world was simultaneously pragmatic and spiritual. They depended on nature for every aspect of survival, and they recognized forces in the world around them that were beyond human control or understanding. Particular mountains, waterfalls, ancient trees, unusual rock formations, these became sites of spiritual significance. This animistic worldview, recognizing spirits or life force in natural phenomena, would later be codified in Shinto, but its roots go back to Jomon times, and likely earlier. Despite the harsh realities of Jomon life, there is evidence of considerable cultural sophistication. The pottery itself, particularly from the Middle Jomon period, is extraordinarily elaborate. Some vessels have rim decorations that rise in flame-like or crown-like patterns. These ornate vessels required tremendous skill to create and serve no obvious practical purpose beyond their beauty. Their existence suggests that Jomon communities had sufficient surplus, at least at times, to support specialized craft production. It also suggests that aesthetic concerns and the creation of beauty were valued. Even in a subsistence economy, trade networks connected Jomon communities across considerable distances. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp cutting tools, was transported hundreds of miles from its sources to communities throughout the Japanese islands. Jade traveled from the mountains where it was found to coastal settlements. Asphalt, used as an adhesive, moved along trade routes. These exchanges required not just the transport of goods, but also the social relationships and trust necessary to maintain trade partnerships across long distances. Over time, Jomon settlements became more permanent and more complex. Large regional hub settlements emerged, featuring substantial buildings with thick pillars. Some sites include raised floor structures that may have been warehouses for storing food. Others have elaborate stone circles, like the famous Oyu stone circles in Akita Prefecture, which some scholars interpret as astronomical observatories or calendrical markers, though their precise function remains debated. The construction of these monuments required coordinated labor from many people, suggesting forms of social organization beyond simple kin groups. Yet for all this cultural development, Jomon life remained fundamentally precarious. You wake before dawn because you must. There is always work to be done. Firewood to gather, water to carry from the stream, food to find, to process, to cook, tools to make and maintain, hides to scrape and tan, cordage to weave, pottery to shape and fire. And all of this while managing the chronic discomfort of parasites in your gut, the ache of old injuries that never quite healed right, the hunger that is never fully satisfied for more than a few days at a time. Children start contributing to these tasks as soon as they are physically capable. A 4-year-old can gather firewood. A 6-year-old can help with processing acorns. By 8 or 10, children are learning to hunt and fish alongside adults, acquiring the skills that will determine whether they survive into adulthood. There is no extended childhood of play and education. There is only survival training. And yet, despite everything, people found moments of joy. They made beautiful things. They told stories around the fire. They danced and sang, almost certainly, though these ephemeral arts leave no archaeological trace. They loved their children and mourned their dead. They were human, fully human, living human lives with all the complexity that entails. But could you live that life? Could you hunt for your food every day, never certain what you might find? Could you live with chronic hunger, with parasites, with the knowledge that a bad harvest season means starvation? Could you watch half your children die before age 5 and still find the strength to continue? The Jomon people did, for 13,000 years. But they were born into that world. They knew no other possibility. You, coming from the modern world, would find it incomprehensibly difficult. Your body would fail you. Your immune system, never challenged by such conditions, would crumble. Your muscles, unused to such constant labor, would give out. Your mind, accustomed to answers and control and the promise of tomorrow, would break under the uncertainty. This is not meant to discourage you from appreciating Jomon culture. Quite the opposite. Understanding how difficult life was makes the achievements of these people all the more remarkable. They not only survived, but created beauty, meaning, and community in conditions we can barely imagine. That is worth remembering. That deserves our respect. The Agricultural Revolution, Yayoi Period. Around 300 BCE, perhaps a century earlier or later depending on the region, everything changed. People from the Korean peninsula and regions to the south began migrating to the Japanese islands in substantial numbers. They brought with them knowledge of wet rice cultivation, bronze and iron metallurgy, and new forms of social organization. This was not a sudden conquest or replacement of the Jomon people. Rather, it was a gradual process of migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange, and adaptation that unfolded over several centuries. The Yayoi period, named after a district in Tokyo where distinctive pottery from this era was first discovered, represents one of the most significant transformations in Japanese history. Wet rice agriculture, paddy field cultivation where rice is grown in flooded fields, revolutionized food production. Unlike the hunting and gathering economy of the Jomon period, which depended on the unpredictable availability of wild resources, rice farming could produce substantial surpluses in good years. A single rice paddy properly managed, would produce far more calories per unit of land than could be obtained from wild plant gathering. This surplus made possible larger populations, more complex social structures, specialized occupations, and ultimately, the rise of political hierarchies. But rice farming was brutally difficult work. First, suitable land had to be identified and prepared. Rice paddies require relatively flat land with access to abundant water. The alluvial valleys where rivers had deposited rich sediment were ideal, but these areas often needed to be cleared of vegetation, leveled and enclosed with earthen dikes to hold water. This required coordinated labor from many people working together. Once land was prepared, the agricultural cycle began. In spring, rice seeds were planted in special seedling beds, where they germinated and began to grow. Meanwhile, the main paddy fields were flooded with water diverted from streams or rivers through elaborate irrigation channels. When the seedlings were several weeks old, they were transplanted by hand into the flooded paddies. This transplanting was backbreaking work. You wade into the muddy water, bend at the waist, and push seedlings into the soft bottom of the paddy, one at a time, in neat rows. Your back screams. Your feet and hands are numb from the cold water. The work continues hour after hour, day after day, until all the seedlings are transplanted. Through the growing season, the paddies must be maintained. Water levels must be monitored and adjusted. Weeds must be pulled. Dikes must be repaired if they develop leaks. In late summer, the water is drained so the rice can dry before harvest. Then comes the cutting, gathering and threshing of the rice, more intensive labor that must be completed quickly before weather can damage the crop. Even after harvest, work continues. Rice must be husked to remove the inedible outer covering. In the Yayoi period, this was done by pounding rice in wooden or stone mortars, hour after hour of repetitive, exhausting labor. The resulting rice was stored in raised floor structures to protect it from moisture and rodents. Some was kept for planting the next year's crop. Some was consumed by the farming family, and some, increasingly, was taken as tax by emerging political authorities. The introduction of rice agriculture did not mean the end of hunting, fishing, and gathering. These activities continued to supplement the diet and provide variety. But rice quickly became the foundation of the economy and the measure of wealth. The word for rice became synonymous with meal. Rice was currency, the medium in which taxes were paid and transactions conducted. Control over rice production meant control over people. With agricultural surplus came the possibility of social stratification. In the Jomon period, where everyone participated in food gathering and where storage of surplus was limited by the nature of wild foods, significant wealth inequality was difficult to maintain. But rice could be stored for years. It could be accumulated. Those who controlled the best land, the best water sources, the most labor, could amass wealth in the form of stored rice. They could support craft specialists, warriors, and administrators who did not directly participate in food production. The Yayoi period saw the emergence of clan-based societies, or uji. These were kinship groups claiming descent from common ancestors, often ancestors with divine or semi-divine status. Different uji controlled different territories, competing for resources and dominance. This competition sometimes erupted into organized violence. Unlike the Jomon period, where evidence of warfare is sparse, the Yayoi period shows clear signs of conflict. Some settlements were fortified with moats and wooden palisades. Skeletal remains show injuries consistent with combat. Bronze weapons, initially ceremonial objects, gradually became practical implements of war. Iron tools and weapons also appeared during the Yayoi period, though at first they were rare and precious. Iron plowshares made agriculture more efficient. Iron axes improved woodworking and land clearing. Iron weapons were superior to bronze in combat. The introduction of metalworking required specialized knowledge and materials. Ores had to be obtained, smelted, forged. This further drove social specialization and the concentration of power in the hands of elites who could control this valuable technology. The physical appearance of Yayoi people differed noticeably from Jomon populations. Yayoi individuals tended to be taller, averaging 2.5 to 5 centimeters more than Jomon people. Their faces were narrower and flatter, with high cheekbones and less pronounced brow ridges. These morphological differences suggest the migrants from the Korean peninsula and elsewhere brought distinct genetic ancestry. Over time, through intermarriage and population mixing, these populations blended, creating the genetic foundation of later Japanese populations. Life for common farmers in the Yayoi period was arguably harder than it had been in Jomon times. The predictability of agricultural surplus came at the cost of ceaseless labor. The agricultural calendar governed existence. There was no rest season. Preparation, planting, maintenance, harvest, processing, each phase demanded long days of physical work. And unlike hunters and gatherers, who might move on when local resources became depleted, farmers were tied to their land. They invested years of labor into paddies and irrigation systems. They could not simply walk away. Moreover, the surplus that rice agriculture created did not primarily benefit the farmers who produced it. Emerging political hierarchies claimed an ever-increasing share as taxation. Village headmen, regional chiefs, and eventually centralized authorities extracted rice from farmers, ostensibly in exchange for protection and governance, but often simply through the threat or application of force. A farmer might work all year to produce a harvest, only to have half of it confiscated. What remained had to feed the farmer's family until the next harvest, with enough left over for the next planting. In bad years, when weather or pests damaged the crop, this equation became impossible. Starvation threatened. Population density increased dramatically during the Yayoi period, particularly in the regions best suited for rice agriculture. More food supported more people, but more people also meant more competition for resources, more potential for conflict, and more vulnerability to disease. When populations live in close proximity with limited sanitation, infectious diseases spread more easily. Epidemics that might have burned through small Jomon settlements and then died out could now sweep through larger Yayoi populations, killing hundreds or thousands. Villages in the Yayoi period consisted of pit dwellings similar to Jomon structures, though some elevated floor buildings also appeared, particularly in later Yayoi. These raised buildings, supported on wooden posts, were used for storing rice and other valuable goods, keeping them dry and safe from pests. The construction of these raised buildings required more sophisticated carpentry than pit dwellings, another indicator of increasing craft specialization. Burial practices in the Yayoi period became more elaborate, at least for elites. Some individuals were buried in large jar coffins or wooden coffins, accompanied by grave goods including bronze mirrors, weapons, and ceremonial bells called dotaku. These burials indicate growing social stratification. Not everyone was equal in death. Some received elaborate funerals with valuable objects that demonstrated their status. Others were buried simply, with few or no grave goods. This difference in burial treatment reflects differences in life. The Yayoi period was creating hierarchies that would become more rigid over time. The spiritual world of Yayoi people blended older Jomon traditions with new influences from the continent. Shamans and ritual specialists played important roles in communities, mediating between the human world and the realm of spirits. Rituals surrounded the agricultural cycle, prayers and offerings made to ensure good harvests. The kami, spirits or deities associated with natural features and ancestral figures, were objects of veneration and fear. To offend a kami could bring disaster. To honor them might bring blessing. This worldview, recognizing the sacred in nature and ancestry, would eventually develop into what we know as Shinto. But for all the cultural and technological developments of the Yayoi period, daily life remained hard and uncertain. If you were a farmer in this era, your days were consumed by agricultural labor. Dawn to dusk in the rice paddies during planting and harvest seasons. The rest of the year spent in endless maintenance and preparation. Your body would be worn down by this labor, joints inflamed, muscles chronically sore, skin damaged by constant exposure to sun and water. You would eat rice, yes, finally a reliable staple. But your diet would still be monotonous and often inadequate. Fish when you could get it. Occasional meat, though increasingly rare as Buddhist influences began to discourage meat consumption. Wild plants gathered to supplement the rice. The chronic malnutrition of the Jomon period might be somewhat alleviated, but nutritional deficiencies would still be common. Vitamin deficiencies, mineral imbalances, the diseases that come from eating a limited diet year after year. And you would have little control over your own life. The clan leader, the village headman, the emerging warrior class, they made decisions that determined your fate. Where you would farm, how much rice you would surrender as tax, whether you would be conscripted to fight in wars over territory and resources. You were a resource yourself, human labor to be extracted and utilized by those with power. power over you. Could you endure it? Could you bend over in a rice paddy for 10 hours a day, every day for months, knowing that much of what you produce will be taken from you? Could you watch your children pressed into the same exhausting cycle with no hope of escape or improvement? Could you live without autonomy, without voice, without the belief that your individual desires matter at all? The Yayoi people did, because they had no choice, because this was simply reality. But for someone from our modern world, where individual autonomy and personal fulfillment are considered fundamental rights, where physical labor has been largely mechanized, where the idea that most people will spend their entire lives as subsistence farmers seems like a nightmare from the distant past, the Yayoi reality would be psychologically devastating long before the physical hardship destroyed your body. Disease, medicine, and the fragility of life. In ancient Japan, disease was not merely a risk, it was a certainty. It stalked through communities with the inevitability of the seasons. It took children before they could walk, mothers in childbirth, warriors in their prime, elders who had survived decades only to be felled by an infection that today would be cured with a simple antibiotic. Medicine existed in forms both practical and spiritual, but its effectiveness was limited. The germ theory of disease lay many centuries in the future. People treated symptoms without understanding causes. They prayed to gods and made offerings at shrines, believing, not unreasonably given their knowledge, that illness was spiritual in origin. The most devastating diseases were those that came in epidemics. Smallpox, a viral infection that caused fever, body aches, and a distinctive rash that often left survivors scarred, swept through Japan repeatedly from the 8th century onward. Historical records indicate that smallpox epidemics occurred approximately every 30 years. This periodicity was not random. It reflected the time required for a population to lose its immunity. Children born after the previous epidemic would have no resistance. When smallpox returned, it spread rapidly through these susceptible populations, killing in great numbers. A smallpox epidemic in the late 10th century, recorded in court sources from 994 CE, killed roughly 69 people at court, about 20% of the court's entire population. The most famous casualty was Fujiwara no Michitaka, a powerful regent whose death opened the path for his brother Michinaga to assume control. Rural populations, with less access to even the limited medical care available in cities, likely suffered even higher mortality rates during epidemics. Measles, another viral infection, followed similar patterns. It too caused periodic epidemics with high mortality, particularly among children. Rubella, influenza, and various other respiratory infections circulated through populations. In the crowded conditions of towns and villages, where people lived in close quarters with poor sanitation, respiratory infections spread easily. A single ill person could infect dozens of others before the community even recognized that an epidemic had begun. Tuberculosis, likely including cases of pneumonia that would be distinguished today but were lumped together in historical records, accounted for approximately 54% of deaths, in some periods according to later analyses of documentary evidence. This disease, caused by bacteria that attack the lungs and other organs, was a slow killer. It caused chronic cough, weakness, weight loss, and eventually death. Without antibiotics, recovery was rare. The disease could linger for months or years, slowly destroying the body while the infected person remained conscious and aware of their deterioration. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, accounted for approximately 20% of recorded deaths in some periods. This nutritional disorder caused swelling, heart problems, and neurological symptoms. It was particularly common among people whose diet consisted mainly of white rice, where the thiamine-rich outer layers of the grain had been removed during processing. Ironically, the preference for white rice as a prestige food meant that wealthier people who could afford to eat refined rice were more susceptible to beriberi than poorer people who ate brown rice or mixed their rice with other grains. Skin diseases, including smallpox but also various bacterial and fungal infections, accounted for approximately 10% of recorded deaths. In an era without antibiotics or effective topical treatments, even minor skin infections could become serious. A small cut that became infected could spread into the bloodstream, causing sepsis and death. Courtiers in the Heian period recorded suffering from itching, so severe they could not sleep, spending entire nights riding horses around the base of mountains in a desperate attempt to distract themselves from the torment. Parasitic infections were ubiquitous. We have already mentioned the whipworm eggs found in Jomon sites, but parasites continued to plague populations throughout ancient Japanese history. Intestinal worms, liver flukes, and other parasites were contracted from contaminated food and water. These organisms might not kill directly, but they weakened their hosts, causing chronic pain, diarrhea, malnutrition, and anemia. A person weakened by parasites was more vulnerable to other diseases. Children with heavy parasite burdens might fail to thrive, remaining stunted and weak throughout their lives. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for women. Without modern obstetric knowledge or techniques, complications that would be routine today were often fatal. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, all could kill. Women who survived multiple births often suffered from lasting injuries, including tears and prolapse of pelvic organs that caused chronic pain and disability. The risk was such that women in court society wrote farewell poems before giving birth, expecting they might die. Injuries were common in a society where almost everyone performed dangerous physical labor. Cuts, broken bones, burns, all occurred regularly. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds could become infected. Broken bones might heal crookedly or not at all, leaving people with permanent disabilities. Burns could leave horrible scarring and limited mobility. And for those injuries that did heal, the process was slow and painful. With no effective pain medication beyond alcohol and perhaps some herbal preparations with limited efficacy. Mental illness was poorly understood and often interpreted through spiritual frameworks. Someone experiencing what we might diagnose as schizophrenia or severe depression might be seen as possessed by an evil spirit. Treatment might consist of exorcism rituals, prayers, or in extreme cases, confinement. The stigma attached to mental illness meant families often hid affected members, adding social isolation to their suffering. Old age, for the few who achieved it, brought its own miseries. Arthritis from decades of physical labor made every movement painful. Vision failed. Hearing declined. Teeth fell out, making eating difficult. Contemporary writers noted that women were better off dying young than living to see their beauty fade. This was not merely vanity. It reflected the reality that in a society where women's value was largely determined by their ability to bear children and their physical appearance, old age meant marginalization and dependency. So what medical treatments were available? In the earliest periods, before significant Chinese influence, medical practice was largely religious. Illness was understood as spiritual affliction. Treatment consisted of prayers, incantations, and rituals designed to appease angry spirits or expel evil forces. Shamans and shrine priests served as healers, their authority deriving from their supposed ability to communicate with the spirit world. Beginning in the 6th century CE, with the formal introduction of Buddhism from China and Korea, medical knowledge from the Asian mainland began to influence Japanese practice. Buddhist temples often included infirmaries where monks provided care based on traditional Chinese medical theories. This system understood health and disease in terms of balance and imbalance of vital energies and elements. Treatment focused on restoring balance through various means. Chinese medical texts reached Japan through official missions and through Buddhist monks who studied on the continent. In 608 CE, according to historical records, Empress Suiko sent young Japanese physicians to China to study. They remained there for 15 years, absorbing medical knowledge before returning to share what they had learned. Over the following centuries, 19 official missions to Tang China brought back not just diplomatic and cultural exchanges, but also medical knowledge, texts, and sometimes actual medicines. The oldest surviving Japanese medical text, the Ishinho, was compiled in 982 by Tamba Yasuyori. This 30-volume work drew entirely from older Chinese medical texts, some of which have since been lost, making the Ishinho valuable not only for Japanese medical history, but also for preserving Chinese knowledge. The text discussed diseases and their treatments, organized primarily by affected organs and body parts. It was based on traditional concepts of yin and yang, and the 5 elements, theories that dominated medical thinking throughout East Asia. Herbal medicines formed the core of practical treatment. Practitioners used various plant-based preparations, believing that different herbs had specific properties that could counteract diseases or restore balance to the body. Some of these remedies had actual pharmacological effects. Others were pure placebo. Neither practitioners nor patients had any way to distinguish between the two. What mattered was belief, and sometimes, fortunately, the body's own healing powers were sufficient. Acupuncture and moxibustion, therapeutic techniques using needles inserted at specific points on the body or the burning of mugwort on the skin, were introduced from China. These practices were based on theories of energy meridians, pathways through which life force or qi was supposed to flow. Illness was attributed to blockages or imbalances in this flow, and treatment aimed to restore proper circulation. Whether these techniques had genuine therapeutic effects beyond placebo remains debated even today. But they were widely practiced, and some people reported benefits. Bloodletting was another treatment, based on the theory that removing excess or impure blood could cure various ailments. Leeches might be applied to draw blood, or small incisions made to allow blood to flow out. This practice was more likely to weaken already ill patients than to help them, but it was considered legitimate medicine. Dietary modifications were prescribed for various conditions, reflecting the understanding that food affected health. This approach had some merit. Prescribing liver to someone with anemia might actually help, though doctors would have understood the benefit in terms of balancing elements rather than iron content. Other dietary recommendations were less effective or actively harmful. By the Heian period, Japan had established a medical affairs system modeled on Chinese bureaucracy. The Taiho Code of 701 CE created government positions for physicians and established the ancestors of what would become departments of medicine and pharmacy. In theory, this meant standardized training and oversight of medical practice. In reality, access to these physicians was limited largely to the aristocracy and wealthy urban populations. Common people, the vast majority of the population, relied on folk remedies, religious healing, and hope. Buddhist institutions played a significant role in providing care to the poor. Empress Komyo, in the 8th century, established the Hidenin and Seiyakuin facilities at Kofuku Temple in Nara, providing free healthcare and medicine to the needy. This was a remarkable exception to the general pattern where medical care was available only to those who could pay. The Buddhist emphasis on compassion motivated some monks to provide charitable care, offering at least basic treatment to people who would otherwise have none. Despite all these medical resources, such as they were, the fundamental reality was that most diseases could not be effectively treated. A patient with smallpox might receive herbal medicines, prayers, and supportive care. But the disease would run its course regardless. They would either survive or die, depending on factors beyond medical control, primarily the strength of their immune system and perhaps sheer luck. Population statistics tell the grim story. Repeated epidemics, particularly in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, reduced Japan's population by approximately 30% compared to its 8th century levels. Court records noted fields abandoned and returned to wilderness, entire villages emptied by disease and death. The population did not begin to recover significantly until agricultural improvements and relative political stability in later periods allowed for sustained growth. Life expectancy for those who survived the dangerous early years of childhood might reach into the 40s or 50s if one was fortunate. But this average conceals the reality that many people died much younger. Accidents, violence, complications of childbirth, acute infections, any of these could strike at any age. Planning for the future was always provisional. You might live to see your children grow. You might not. This uncertainty shaped how people thought about existence. The Buddhist concept of impermanence was not abstract philosophy. It was daily reality. Your health, your family, your very life, all were transient and could be taken at any moment. This awareness might lead to a kind of liberation, a letting go of attachment since nothing could be held anyway. Or it might lead to profound anxiety, a constant background dread that the next disaster was imminent. Could you live with this? Could you watch a child die from an infection that today would be cured with a week of antibiotics? Could you yourself suffer from chronic parasitic infection, your body constantly fighting invaders, knowing that this discomfort would be with you for your entire life? Could you face the possibility that any injury, any exposure to epidemic disease might be the thing that kills you, with medicine offering little more than prayers and herbs? The people of ancient Japan did. They had no choice. And remarkably, many found ways to live richly despite the constant threat. They created art and literature. They loved deeply. They found meaning in relationships, in spiritual practice, in the beauty of cherry blossoms and the turn of the seasons. They were resilient in ways we can hardly comprehend. But that resilience came at a cost. It was forged through suffering that left scars, physical and psychological. And it required an acceptance of pain and loss that modern people, raised with the expectation that health is normal and that medicine can fix most problems, simply do not possess. We would be broken by what they endured. This is not a failure on our part. It is simply a recognition that we are products of different worlds. Food, famine, and the constant specter of hunger. Rice, the foundation of the Japanese diet, the measure of wealth, the medium of taxation, was ironically something many Japanese people rarely ate in adequate quantities. For the peasant farmer who spent their life growing rice, white rice was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The farmer ate other grains, barley, wheat, millet, mixed with a small amount of rice when times were good, eating only these lesser grains when times were hard. The rice they grew was taken as tax, paid to the lord who controlled their land, sent to the capital to feed aristocrats and administrators, used as wages for soldiers and laborers. The farmer kept barely enough to plant the next year's crop. This created a cruel irony. The harder you worked growing rice, the less rice you yourself ate. Success as a farmer meant producing more, which meant more was taken from you. The only way to keep more for yourself was to hide some of the harvest, a risky strategy that, if discovered, could bring severe punishment. So most farmers accepted their fate, worked themselves to exhaustion in the rice paddies, and ate a monotonous diet of coarser grains, supplemented by whatever else they could scrounge. The Tokugawa shoguns, in later periods, actively encouraged peasants to eat barley, wheat, and millet rather than rice, explicitly stating that these lesser grains were appropriate for lower classes. This policy had economic motivations. It ensured that maximum amounts of rice were available for taxation and for feeding urban populations and samurai warriors. But it also had nutritional consequences. Brown rice contains thiamine, vitamin B1, in the outer layers of the grain. When people ate unmilled rice or rice mixed with other grains, they received adequate thiamine. But those who ate primarily refined white rice could develop beriberi, as mentioned earlier. Meanwhile, those who could not afford white rice and ate coarser grains were paradoxically better nourished, at least regarding thiamine intake. Beyond rice and other grains, the ancient Japanese diet included a variety of other foods when they were available. Fish and seafood were extremely important, particularly in coastal areas. The surrounding seas provided an abundance of marine life. Sardines, mackerel, bonito, bream, sea bass, eel, salmon, trout, and many other species were caught using nets, lines, and traps. Shellfish could be gathered from rocky shores. Seaweed, kelp, and other marine plants were harvested and used both as food and as flavoring. Fish were prepared in various ways. Fresh fish were eaten when available, often raw or lightly seared. But most fish were preserved, either by drying in the sun and wind or by salting. Dried fish could be stored for months, providing a crucial protein source during seasons when fresh catches were limited. Salted and fermented fish products developed as well, precursors to modern Japanese fermented foods. Meat from land animals was consumed in prehistoric and early historic periods. Venison, wild boar, and fowl appeared in archaeological food remains. But beginning in the 7th century CE, as Buddhism became officially established, eating meat from mammals and birds became increasingly restricted. Emperor Tenmu's decree in 675 CE prohibited the consumption of cattle, horses, dogs, monkeys, and chickens during certain months of the year. This prohibition was ostensibly religious, based on Buddhist compassion for sentient beings, but it also had practical economic motivations. Cattle and horses were valuable for agricultural labor and transportation. Killing them for meat was wasteful of resources better used for working. The prohibition was never absolute, and practices varied by region and time period. Mountain people continued to hunt and eat wild game. Some Buddhist prohibitions specifically exempted boar and deer. But the general cultural shift away from meat consumption was real and lasting. By the Heian period, meat eating, particularly of domesticated animals, was considered crude and uncivilized, something barbarians did, but proper Japanese people did not. When Portuguese and later Dutch traders arrived in early modern Japan, their meat consumption was viewed with a mixture of fascination and disgust. This dietary shift meant that most Japanese people got their protein primarily from fish and soy products. Soybeans, introduced during the Yayoi period, became increasingly important over time. They could be boiled and eaten whole, but more commonly, they were processed into various forms. Tofu, soy milk curdled and pressed into blocks, appeared during the Nara period. Miso, fermented soybean paste, was used as flavoring and preserved protein. Soy sauce, though its development into the form we recognize today came later, evolved from various fermented soy products used for seasoning. Vegetables provided essential nutrients and variety. Peasants grew and gathered a wide array of plant foods. Japanese sweet potatoes, introduced later, would become crucial to preventing famine. But in earlier periods, other crops served similar supplementary roles. Radishes, particularly the large daikon radish, were a staple. Eggplants, cucumbers, burdock root, bamboo shoots, various leafy greens, onions, and garlic were all cultivated or gathered. Mushrooms, harvested from forests, added flavor and nutrients. Edible wild plants, knowledge of which was passed down through generations, supplemented cultivated foods. Fruits were seasonal treats. Persimmons, pears, plums, and various berries grew wild or were cultivated. Chestnuts, walnuts, and other nuts provided calories and protein, continuing the tradition from Jomon times. But fruits and nuts were often scarce, eaten fresh when available, but hard to store for long periods without spoiling. Food preservation was essential for survival. Without refrigeration, most foods spoiled quickly, particularly in Japan's humid climate. Drying, salting, fermenting, and pickling were the main preservation methods. Vegetables were pickled in salt or rice bran. Fish were salted, dried, or fermented. Some foods were smoked. Rice, properly dried and stored in raised warehouses, could keep for years. But storage facilities were vulnerable to pests, moisture, and in times of disaster, fire or flood. The way food was prepared reflected both practical constraints and emerging aesthetic values. Cooking was done over open fires or small charcoal braziers. Pots were ceramic or iron. Kettles hung over flames on adjustable hooks. Food was often boiled or steamed rather than fried, partly because cooking oil was expensive and scarce. Sesame oil, safflower oil, and grapeseed oil were produced, but these were costly and used sparingly. Most people, particularly in rural areas, simply boiled or roasted their food. Seasoning was simple. Salt, the most basic seasoning, was essential not just for flavor, but for preserving food. It was produced by evaporating seawater or mining salt deposits. Vinegar, made from rice or other grains, provided acid flavoring. Fermented products like miso and early forms of soy sauce added umami, that savory taste that makes food satisfying. Ginger, garlic, and various herbs added variety. But compared to the elaborate spicing in many other culinary traditions, Japanese food was relatively restrained in seasoning, focusing on bringing out the natural flavors of ingredients. Meals themselves were simple for most people. Commoners ate twice a day, typically a morning meal around mid-morning and an evening meal. These consisted of rice or grain porridge, perhaps with some vegetables mixed in. Maybe a small piece of fish if they were lucky, and tea or hot water to drink. There was no abundance, no variety, just sustenance to keep working. Aristocrats, by contrast, might eat more elaborately, with multiple small dishes carefully arranged for aesthetic appeal as well as flavor. But even for them, meals were constrained by seasonal availability and the limitations of preservation technology. And always, there was the threat of hunger. A bad harvest could mean starvation, too much rain, too little rain, unseasonable cold, typhoon damage, pest infestations. Any of these could devastate crops. Rice was most vulnerable, requiring specific conditions to thrive. But other crops could fail too, leaving entire regions with inadequate food. Historical records document severe famines during the 18th century, particularly in the 1730s and 1780s, though these are later than our primary period of focus. But famines occurred throughout Japanese history. The chronicles that do mention them describe horrific scenes of starvation, of people eating bark and roots, of families abandoning children they could not feed, of bodies lying in streets. These were not rare once-in-a-lifetime events. They happened regularly enough that every generation experienced at least one major food shortage. The sweet potato, mentioned in the search results as having saved millions of lives during those later famines, was introduced to Japan from abroad and gradually adopted as a famine prevention crop. It could grow in poor soil, required less water than rice, and could be stored for relatively long periods. Almost every part of the plant was edible. During the Great Famines, sweet potatoes quite literally meant the difference between survival and death for huge numbers of people. But before sweet potatoes were available, there was no such safety net. When rice failed, people starved. Malnutrition was chronic for many people, even in years without famine. The diet, heavy in carbohydrates from rice and other grains, often lacked adequate protein, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Children grew up stunted. Women's fertility was affected by nutritional stress. Adults suffered from various deficiency diseases. Anemia was common, particularly in women who lost blood during menstruation and childbirth. Vitamin deficiencies caused problems ranging from impaired night vision to bleeding gums to bone malformations in children. The psychological toll of hunger cannot be overstated. Chronic hunger is not like missing a meal or two. It is a constant gnawing ache, a weakness in the limbs, an inability to concentrate, an irritability that strains all social relationships. Children growing up always hungry do not develop normally, physically or cognitively. Adults living with inadequate nutrition cannot work at full capacity, yet they must continue to work because there is no alternative. The cruel mathematics of subsistence agriculture means you must work yourself to exhaustion to produce food. But insufficient food means you cannot work effectively, creating a cycle that traps populations in poverty. Think about your own experience with hunger. Perhaps you have felt it when you skipped breakfast and lunch became delayed. An uncomfortable feeling, certainly, but one you knew would end soon. Now imagine that feeling continuing for days, weeks, months. Imagine feeding your children, watching them eat their small portions, knowing it is not enough but having nothing more to give them. Imagine seeing them grow thin and listless, their bellies swollen from malnutrition and being powerless to help. Could you endure that? Could you continue functioning while constantly hungry? Could you maintain hope when you know that even your best efforts might not be enough to prevent starvation? The people of ancient Japan did, because they had no choice. But we, products of a world where food is abundant and varied, where hunger is an occasional discomfort rather than a permanent condition, we are not psychologically equipped for that reality. Even setting aside hunger, could you survive on the limited, monotonous diet available to most ancient Japanese people? Day after day of rice or grain porridge, occasional vegetables, small amounts of fish or soy products, almost no sugar, no spices, limited oil, no coffee, no chocolate, none of the flavors and variety we take for granted. It is not just that you would miss these things, though you would. It is that your body, accustomed to a varied diet rich in nutrients, would suffer. Deficiency diseases would develop, your health would decline, and the water. Remember that people in ancient Japan understood that boiling water made it safer to drink, even if they did not understand why. But boiling water requires fuel, wood, or charcoal, which takes time and labor to gather or purchase. In many situations, people drank unboiled water because they had no choice, and contaminated water caused intestinal diseases. Diarrhea, seemingly a minor inconvenience in the modern world where oral rehydration solutions and antibiotics are readily available, was a major killer in ancient times, particularly of children. Severe diarrhea causes rapid dehydration, and without proper treatment, it can kill in days or even hours. Food security is something most of us never think about. We open a refrigerator and find food. We visit a market and choose from an overwhelming variety. We have comfort in knowing that if we have money, food is available. The people of ancient Japan had no such certainty. Food was always provisional, always dependent on factors beyond their control. A bad harvest could mean death. This awareness shaped everything about how they lived, how they thought, how they raised their children. It was the dark background against which all other concerns played out. So when we ask whether we could survive in ancient Japan, we must grapple with this fundamental question. Could we live with hunger as a constant companion? Could we accept that all our labor might not be enough? Could we watch our children go hungry? The honest answer, for most of us, is no. Not because we lack courage, but because we have never developed the psychological tools necessary to cope with that level of privation. We would break. Our bodies and spirits would fail us. And that is precisely why we must honor those who endured what we cannot imagine enduring. Daily life in Heian, Japan. Two worlds. The Heian period, from 794 to 1185 CE, represents the classical age of Japanese culture. It is the period most often romanticized in popular imagination, the era of elegant court ladies writing poetry, of refined aesthetic sensibilities, of artistic and literary flowering. The tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel, emerged from Heian court culture, as did The Pillow Book and numerous other literary masterpieces. The Japanese writing system developed into its recognizable form. Art, architecture, and religious practice all reached new heights of sophistication. But this cultural brilliance was the achievement of a tiny elite, perhaps 5,000 people out of a total population of 5 million. For them, life was indeed refined, luxurious by the standards of the time, dedicated to the cultivation of beauty and aesthetic sensibility. For everyone else, for the vast majority of Japanese people, life remained brutally hard, dominated by agricultural labor, poverty, and powerlessness. These two worlds existed side by side, each dependent on the other, yet separated by an almost unbridgeable gulf of privilege and experience. Let us look first at the world of the aristocracy, because it is this world that has left us the most complete historical record. Heian court culture was centered in Heian-kyo, the capital city now known as Kyoto. The emperor, though increasingly a figurehead as power passed to regents and powerful noble families like the Fujiwara, remained the symbolic center of this world. Around the emperor gathered the court nobility, the kyuge, who lived lives of ritual, ceremony, and artistic refinement. For aristocratic women, life was extraordinarily constrained despite their intellectual and artistic accomplishments. They lived in secluded areas of large wooden mansions, hidden behind screens and curtains. They rarely left their homes, and when they did, they traveled in ox-drawn carriages hung with heavy silk blinds that obscured the view both out and in. Direct eye contact between men and women who were not married or closely related was considered inappropriate. Courtship happened through the exchange of poems, with lovers communicating through curtains and screens, sometimes never seeing each other clearly, even as they developed intimate relationships. Physical beauty was carefully curated, according to specific standards. Women shaved their eyebrows and then painted new ones high on their foreheads. They blackened their teeth with a dye made from iron filings soaked in tea or vinegar, because white teeth were considered ugly. They powdered their faces with white lead-based cosmetics. Their hair, never cut, was worn long, ideally trailing on the ground when they stood. Women who achieved this extraordinary length enhanced it with hairpieces if necessary. Massive, layered silk robes, some outfits consisting of 12 or more layers, concealed their bodies entirely. The color combinations of these layers were subject to complex rules based on season, occasion, and rank. Men of the aristocracy also attended closely to their appearance. They too used cosmetics, though more subtly than women. Ideal male beauty included thin facial hair, just a wisp of mustache, and perhaps a small goatee, and eyebrows positioned high on the forehead, though not shaved and redrawn like women's. Men wore elaborate court robes for formal occasions and slightly simpler garments for daily life. But even casual aristocratic clothing was far more ornate than anything commoners would wear. The ability to compose poetry was essential for both men and women of the court. Every occasion demanded a poem, a beautiful scene of nature, a flower arrangement, a visit from a friend, the beginning or end of a love affair. All required appropriate poetic response. One's reputation could be made or destroyed by the quality and appropriateness of their verses. A poorly composed or inappropriate poem could ruin a courtship, damage political alliances, or become the subject of court gossip for years. The pressure to perform literarily must have been immense. Court life followed rigid ceremonial protocols. Every action had a correct form. How one sat, how one spoke, how one moved, all were governed by complex rules that varied by rank, occasion, and relationship. Learning these rules was the work of a lifetime. Children of the aristocracy began their education in etiquette almost as soon as they could walk. Missteps could bring shame not just to the individual, but to their entire family. The aristocratic day was structured around ceremony and leisure. Nobles woke relatively late, well after dawn. They might spend hours on grooming and dressing, assisted by servants. They would attend to correspondence, writing letters and poems. They might practice calligraphy, an art form in itself where the quality of one's brushwork was as important as the content of the text. They participated in religious observances, both Buddhist and Shinto, which were woven throughout the calendar. They visited each other, maintaining the complex social networks that determined political power and influence. They attended festivals and celebrations. They played music, particularly the koto, a stringed instrument, and various flutes. They engaged in parlor games, aesthetic competitions, and other refined entertainments. What they did not do was any physical labor. They did not cook their own food, clean their homes, tend gardens, or perform any of the countless tasks necessary for daily life. An army of servants, people from the lower classes, did all of this invisible work. To an aristocrat, these servants were barely people, more like furniture that happened to move and perform useful functions. The idea that servants had their own lives, their own hopes and fears, their own struggles, would rarely occur to a court noble. The class divide was so profound that they might as well have been different species. The food aristocrats ate was elaborate by contemporary standards, though still limited by the technology and seasonal availability that constrained everyone. Multiple small dishes were served, arranged with attention to visual appeal. The aesthetic of the meal was as important as its flavor. A meal might include rice, multiple fish preparations, various pickled or cooked vegetables, soups, and seasonal delicacies. Aristocrats ate twice daily, once around mid-morning and again in late afternoon. Now let us turn to the other world, the world of the peasantry and common people. This was the world where the vast majority of Japanese people lived, and it bore almost no resemblance to court culture. Peasant life centered on agricultural labor. From before dawn until after dusk, every day of the growing season, work continued. Rice agriculture, as we have discussed, was brutally demanding. But even outside the intensive planting and harvest seasons, work never ceased. Fields had to be prepared, irrigation channels maintained, terraces repaired, tools made and mended, firewood gathered, food prepared, clothing woven and mended. Peasant homes were simple pit dwellings or small wooden structures with earthen floors, thatched roofs and minimal furnishings. There might be a fireplace for cooking and heat. Sleeping arrangements were communal, families crowding together on thin mats for warmth. Privacy did not exist. Light came from the fire and from small oil lamps or candles, expensive and used sparingly, so most activities happened during daylight hours. After dark, there was little to do but sleep. Clothing for commoners was functional and plain. Hemp or ramie cloth, coarse and durable, was woven into simple garments. Colors were natural, undyed, or dyed with inexpensive plant-based dyes in browns, greys, and muted tones. Most people owned only a few garments, worn repeatedly and mended when they developed holes. In winter, layering and adding padding provided some insulation. In summer, lighter versions of the same basic garments allowed for work in the heat. Shoes, when worn at all, were simple straw sandals. Often people worked barefoot. The peasant diet we have already examined. Coarse grains, small amounts of vegetables, occasional fish or soy products. Always inadequate, always leaving you hungry for more. Meals were quick, functional affairs, not occasions for aesthetic enjoyment, but simply fuel to continue working. Children of peasant families began contributing to household labor as soon as they were physically capable. By age 7 or 8, children could gather firewood, carry water, help with weeding, and perform other simple tasks. By adolescence, they were full participants in agricultural work. Education, in the sense of literacy or artistic training, was completely unavailable to them. They learned the skills necessary for survival. How to plant rice, how to repair tools, how to preserve food, how to endure hardship. These were the lessons of their childhood. Women's work was unrelenting. In addition to participating in agricultural labor, women were responsible for processing and cooking food, making and repairing clothing, and childcare. They gave birth without any medical assistance beyond perhaps the help of experienced older women. They nursed infants while continuing to work. They raised children while managing households. The physical toll was enormous. Women's bodies wore out quickly. Those who survived multiple childbirths often suffered chronic health problems. The psychological weight of peasant life must have been crushing. You wake before dawn knowing that the entire day will be spent in exhausting labor. You know that no matter how hard you work, most of what you produce will be taken as tax. You know that one bad harvest could mean starvation. You know that your children will live the same life you live, with no possibility of improvement or escape. You have no voice in decisions that affect your life. You are utterly powerless, a resource to be exploited by those above you. And yet, people endured. They found small joys. They loved their children and their partners. They took pride in their work. in a well-tended field, in a successful harvest. They gathered for festivals and celebrations, brief respites from the endless labor. They developed folk customs and community bonds that provided some meaning and support. They were resilient in ways we can scarcely understand. But we must not romanticize this resilience. It was not chosen. It was necessary for survival. And it came at a terrible cost in human suffering. The fact that people endured does not mean that their suffering was acceptable or that we should minimize it. The gulf between court aristocrats and peasants was so wide that they might as well have lived in different countries. An aristocrat worrying about which color combination to wear that day and whether their latest poem was sufficiently elegant had no comprehension of the peasant worrying about whether their children would eat that day. And the peasant, if they even knew anything about court culture, would have found it utterly alien and irrelevant to their concerns. For us, the question is not which of these worlds we could survive in. It is whether we could survive in either. The aristocratic world, despite its luxury, would be psychologically stifling. The rigid rules, the lack of privacy, the constant pressure to perform socially and artistically, the complete dependence on the whims of those more powerful, all of this would be difficult for someone raised in a culture that values individual autonomy and authenticity. But the peasant world would be even more impossible. The physical labor alone would break most of us. The chronic hunger, the lack of medical care, the powerlessness, the certainty that your children will inherit your suffering. All of this would be unbearable. We are not physically or psychologically equipped for that life. And that is perhaps the most important realization. We look at history and see cultural achievements, and we are impressed. But we must never forget that these achievements were built on the backs of people whose lives were characterized by suffering we cannot truly imagine. Respecting ancient Japanese culture means respecting both the beauty and the horror, the refinement and the brutality, the soaring artistic achievements and the crushing poverty that made them possible. Could you have lived in Heian, Japan? Honestly, probably not. Not in either world. The aristocratic world would confine and suffocate you. The peasant world would literally kill you through disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. This is not a failure on your part. It is simply recognition that we are products of our time, shaped by modern privileges we rarely even recognize as privileges. Medical care, abundant food, individual rights. These are not universal human experiences. They are recent inventions, luxuries our ancestors never knew. Understanding this should make us humble and grateful, and it should make us honor those who survived what we could not survive. Hygiene, bathing, and sanitation. The modern visitor to Japan is often struck by the cleanliness of public spaces and the elaborate bathing culture. Public baths, or sento, remain important social institutions. Hot spring resorts, or onsen, draw millions of visitors annually. Japanese toilets are technological marvels. This cultural emphasis on cleanliness has deep historical roots, but we must be careful not to project modern standards backward into ancient times. While bathing practices in Japan developed earlier and more extensively than in medieval Europe, hygiene and sanitation in ancient Japan was still rudimentary by contemporary standards. Bathing as a cultural practice in Japan traces its origins to religious purification rituals. Shinto, the indigenous spiritual tradition of Japan, emphasized ritual purity. Before approaching a shrine or participating in religious ceremonies, individuals were expected to purify themselves. This originally meant rinsing with water from a river or the sea, a practice called misoji. The physical act of washing was simultaneously a spiritual cleansing, removing both physical dirt and spiritual pollution or impurity. When Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century CE, it brought with it additional cultural influences regarding bathing. Chinese Buddhist temples often included bathing facilities for monks, and this practice was adopted in Japan. Temple baths were constructed primarily for ritual purification rather than hygiene, but the physical act of bathing, regardless of intention, does provide hygienic benefits. Buddhist teachings stated that bathing could cast off 7 ailments and acquire 7 blessings, giving religious justification for the practice. Some temples began offering free baths to the poor, facilities called seiyoku, providing common people access to bathing opportunities they might not otherwise have. This charitable practice gradually normalized bathing as an activity not exclusively restricted to religious contexts. By the Heian period, bathing was becoming more common among the aristocracy, though the form differed from what we might recognize today as a bath. Early bathing facilities were mushi-buro, essentially steam baths similar to saunas. A fire heated stones or water in an enclosed space, creating steam and heat. People would enter this steam-filled room to sweat, the heat opening pores and loosening dirt. They might then rinse with water, but the primary cleansing mechanism was the steam itself. These steam baths were dark, smoky, and intensely hot. They were not particularly comfortable by modern standards, but they served their function. In the late 16th century, more recognizable bathhouses began to emerge. These sento were public facilities where people could pay a small fee to bathe. The early sento featured large wooden tubs that could be filled with hot water, allowing people to immerse themselves up to their shoulders. This marks the beginning of the bathing style we now associate with Japanese culture, where soaking in hot water is the central element of the bathing experience. The bathing process that developed involved first washing outside the tub, using buckets of water to rinse oneself clean, and only then entering the tub to soak. This practice, which continues in modern Japanese bathing, served a practical purpose. If everyone washed before entering the communal tub, the water stayed relatively clean and could be shared by many bathers. The soaking was for relaxation and warmth rather than for washing. This distinction between washing and soaking was important for maintaining hygiene in public bathing facilities. Public bathhouses became important social spaces. particularly for the common people who had no bathing facilities in their own homes. People would gather at the bathhouse not just to bathe, but to socialize, exchange news and gossip, and maintain community bonds. The bathhouse was one of the few public spaces where social barriers lowered somewhat. Though classes remained distinct, the shared vulnerability of being naked and the common experience of bathing created a degree of social leveling that existed nowhere else in rigidly hierarchical Japanese society. One aspect of historical Japanese bathing culture that shocks modern sensibilities was the practice of mixed bathing, or konyoku. Until the mid-19th century, it was normal for men and women to bathe together in public bathhouses. This was not considered sexual or inappropriate. Nudity in the bathing context was simply a practical necessity, and the presence of both sexes was unremarkable. Western visitors, particularly after Commodore Perry's missions to Japan in the 1850s, were scandalized by this practice. Their reaction reflected Western cultural assumptions about nudity and sexuality that were not shared by Japanese culture. Under pressure from Western powers during the Meiji period after 1868, Japanese authorities began banning mixed bathing, initially in major cities like Tokyo and Osaka, gradually spreading to other areas. This was part of a broader effort to modernize Japan according to Western standards, to make the country appear civilized in European eyes. Traditional mixed bathing persisted in rural areas for many more decades, and even today, a few traditional onsen continue the practice, though it is rare and attracts primarily older patrons for whom it represents a connection to earlier times. For the aristocracy in the Heian period, bathing was available in private facilities within their mansions. Hot water would be prepared by servants and brought to a bathing area where the noble could wash and soak in relative privacy. This was obviously more comfortable and luxurious than public bathing, but the basic process was similar. Records indicate that nobles offered baths to overnight guests as a gesture of hospitality, suggesting that bathing was considered an expected courtesy, at least in wealthy households. However, even among the aristocracy, daily bathing was not necessarily the norm. The effort required to heat sufficient water for a bath was substantial, requiring large amounts of firewood and significant labor. Bathing might occur several times per week rather than daily. This might sound infrequent to modern ears, but it was remarkably hygienic compared to many other contemporary cultures. For peasants, bathing was much less frequent. The labor and resources required to heat water were the same regardless of class, but peasants had far less access to fuel and time. They worked from dawn to dusk, and spending hours gathering firewood and heating water for a bath was a luxury they could rarely afford. They might bathe when visiting a temple that offered free bathing facilities, or occasionally on festival days or other special occasions. Most of the time, washing consisted of splashing cold water on the face and hands, perhaps rinsing off major dirt, but full-body bathing was infrequent. This meant that most people, most of the time, smelled strongly by modern standards. Body odor was simply part of life. Combined with the smell of wood smoke that permeated clothing and homes, the smell of farm animals, the smell of human waste used as fertilizer in fields, the smell of unwashed bodies wearing repeatedly worn and infrequently laundered clothing. Ancient Japan was a notably odorous place. Our modern sensitivity to smell, conditioned by daily showers, deodorants, laundry detergents, and air fresheners, would be overwhelmed. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Human waste was collected and used as fertilizer, a practical recycling of nutrients back into agricultural systems. This practice, while environmentally sensible in some ways, created numerous opportunities for disease transmission. Parasites and bacteria from human waste contaminated hands, tools, and eventually food and water supplies. Hand washing, in the sense of carefully cleaning hands with soap after using the toilet or before eating, was not practiced because the connection between unwashed hands and disease was not understood. Toilets, where they existed at all, were simple pits or boxes positioned over pits. Privacy was minimal. Toilet paper did not exist. People used leaves, moss, or simply their hands, rinsed with water if available. The concept of flushing waste away did not exist. Waste accumulated until it was collected for use as fertilizer. In urban areas, waste collection became necessary as populations increased. Night soil collectors would come through streets, gathering human waste from household collection points and transporting it to farms where it would be sold as fertilizer. This created employment, but also spread disease. The smell in cities, particularly in summer, must have been overpowering. Garbage and food waste presented additional sanitation challenges. There was no organized waste collection in the modern sense. People discarded waste in rivers, dumped it in designated areas on the outskirts of settlements, or buried it if they had the time and inclination. This waste attracted rats, insects, and stray dogs, all of which could carry disease. The rat-flea-human transmission chain that spreads plague, for instance, thrives in environments where food waste and human waste are readily accessible to rodents. Drinking water was another serious health concern. People obtained water from wells, streams, and rivers. This water was often contaminated with human and animal waste, agricultural runoff, and various other pollutants. As mentioned earlier, people understood that boiling water made it safer, though they did not understand the mechanisms. Boiled water was consumed as hot tea or simply as hot water, but boiling required fuel and time. When these were scarce, people drank untreated water, risking waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera. In the rainy season and during typhoons, flooding could overwhelm sanitation systems entirely. Wells became contaminated. Waste pits overflowed. Rivers that served as both water sources and sewers swelled and spread their contamination across wide areas. The period following major floods was always accompanied by spikes in disease, as contaminated water supplies caused epidemics of intestinal illness. Personal hygiene beyond bathing was limited. Toothbrushing did not exist in the form we know it, though people might chew on twigs to clean their teeth or rub them with cloth. Dental hygiene was poor, and tooth decay was common. The pain of infected teeth with no access to dental care must have been excruciating. Hair washing was infrequent, especially for aristocratic women whose extremely long hair would take hours to wash and days to dry completely. Hair might be washed only a few times per year. In the interim, it was combed carefully, perhaps perfumed with incense smoke, but not actually washed. This attracted lice and other parasites that lived in unwashed hair. Nit-picking, the careful removal of lice eggs from hair, was a regular grooming activity and probably a social bonding practice as well. Clothing was washed occasionally, but not frequently. The labor involved in washing clothing was substantial. Water had to be fetched and heated. Lye soap, made from wood ash, was available but harsh on fabric and skin. Clothing was beaten on rocks or scrubbed against washboards to remove dirt. Then it had to be rinsed and dried, which in Japan's humid climate could take a long time. All of this meant clothing was worn repeatedly between washings, accumulating dirt, sweat, and odors. Could you adapt to these hygienic conditions? Could you go days or weeks between baths? Could you live with body odor, yours and everyone else's, as a constant background reality? Could you use toilet facilities that were little more than holes in the ground, with no privacy and no way to properly clean yourself afterward? Could you drink water knowing it might be contaminated but having no alternative? Could you live with lice in your hair and parasites in your gut? The people of ancient Japan managed because they had no concept of an alternative. They did not know that microscopic organisms caused disease. They did not know that regular hand washing prevented illness. They did not have running water or indoor plumbing or antibacterial soap. They lived in the conditions available to them and did their best to maintain health within those constraints. But you, coming from a world of daily showers, flush toilets, water treatment plants, and an understanding of germ theory, would find these conditions almost unbearable. The smell alone would be a constant assault. The feeling of being dirty, of wearing unwashed clothing and having unwashed hair, would be psychologically distressing. The knowledge that the water you drink and the food you eat are likely contaminated would create constant anxiety. And the reality of diseases spread by poor sanitation would threaten your health and life. This is not meant to diminish the achievements of ancient Japanese culture in developing bathing practices more sophisticated than many other contemporary societies. The recognition of bathing as beneficial. The creation of public bathing facilities. The integration of bathing into social and spiritual life. All of these were significant cultural developments. But we must also be honest about the limitations. Hygiene and sanitation in ancient Japan were, by modern standards, grossly inadequate. People lived with parasites, diseases, and discomfort that we find unacceptable, and they had no choice but to accept these conditions as normal. The rise of the warrior class, the Kamakura period. By the late 12th century, the political landscape of Japan had fundamentally transformed. The Heian period's aristocratic refinement was giving way to the harsh realities of military rule. In 1185, after years of devastating civil war between the Minamoto and Taira clans, Minamoto no Yoritomo emerged victorious. 7 years later, in 1192, the emperor granted him the title of Sei Taishogun, or great general who subdues the barbarians, commonly shortened to shogun. This marked the beginning of the Kamakura period and the establishment of a military government, or bakufu, that would set the pattern for Japanese political structure for the next 675 years. The shogunate was a revolutionary development in Japanese governance. For the first time, real political power rested not with the emperor or court aristocrats, but with military men, samurai warriors who valued martial prowess and loyalty over literary accomplishment and aesthetic refinement. The emperor remained as a figurehead, revered as a sacred descendant of the sun goddess, but possessing little actual authority. The court nobility in Kyoto continued their refined cultural pursuits, writing poetry and perfecting ceremonies, but they were increasingly irrelevant to the actual governance of the country. The samurai who rose to power during this period were not the highly romanticized figures of later legend. They were professional warriors, certainly, but they were also pragmatic men who understood that power came from control of land and the agricultural production it generated. Samurai were granted control over estates, or shuen, in exchange for military service to their lords. This created a feudal system where loyalty and military obligation bound society together. Life as a samurai warrior was dangerous and demanding. Training began in childhood. Boys from samurai families started learning horsemanship, archery, and sword work as soon as they were physically capable, often around age 5 or 6. By adolescence, they were expected to be competent in all the essential martial skills. Mastery required years of practice. An archer needed to develop strength to draw a powerful bow, precision to hit targets from horseback, and the mental discipline to remain calm in battle. Swordsmanship required not just physical skill, but also strategic thinking and the ability to read opponents. Horsemanship was essential, as samurai fought primarily as mounted warriors during this period. But martial training was not limited to physical skills. Samurai were expected to be literate and educated. They needed to understand strategy and military classics. They had to know proper etiquette and comportment. They were supposed to be cultured men, capable of appreciating art and poetry, not mere brutes who knew only violence. This expectation that warriors should be cultivated individuals set Japanese warrior culture apart from purely military castes in other societies. The emerging code of conduct that would later be formalized as Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty above all else. A samurai's primary obligation was to his lord. He was expected to obey without question, to fight without hesitation, and, if necessary, to die without complaint. This absolute loyalty was the glue that held the military hierarchy together. Without it, the entire system would collapse into chaos. Combat in the early Kamakura period followed specific conventions that reflected the social structure and values of samurai culture. Battles were not the chaotic melees of massed infantry that characterized warfare in many other regions. Instead, combat began with challenges issued between individual warriors. A samurai would ride forth from his line announce his name and lineage, and challenge opposing warriors to single combat. The opponent would respond with their own credentials, and the two would engage in what was essentially a formalized duel. First with bow and arrow, then if they closed to contact, with swords or other hand weapons. This style of warfare was intensely personal. You fought individual opponents, men whose names and families you learned before trying to kill them. Victory or defeat, killing or being killed, all happened face to face. There was no anonymity, no striking from a distance without seeing the results. The psychological toll must have been immense. You carried the memory of every man you killed, knew the family you had destroyed, bore the weight of taking a life in a way that modern warfare, with its distance and depersonalization, does not require. When the Mongols attempted to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281, samurai warriors encountered an enemy who did not follow their rules. Mongol forces, made up of ethnic Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans, fought as coordinated units. They used massed archery, explosive weapons, and tactical discipline that seemed cowardly to samurai accustomed to individual combat. The Mongols did not announce themselves. They did not pause for challenges. They simply attacked with overwhelming force, seeking military objectives rather than personal glory. Japanese sources describe samurai bewilderment at these tactics. The Mongol use of conscripted infantry rather than elite warrior nobility seemed dishonorable. The refusal to engage in ritual challenges was seen as evidence of moral inferiority. But beneath this cultural critique was the cold reality that Mongol tactics were effective. The first invasion in 1274 saw Japanese defenders pushed back despite fierce resistance. The second invasion in 1281 was even larger, with a combined force of over 100,000 troops carried by thousands of ships. Both invasions ultimately failed, but not because of Japanese military superiority. Typhoons struck both invasion fleets, destroying ships and drowning tens of thousands of invaders. The Japanese interpreted these typhoons as divine wind, or kamikaze, sent by the gods to protect Japan. This reinforced the cultural belief that Japan was a sacred land under divine protection. But samurai who had faced Mongol forces knew how close they had come to defeat. The experience prompted some tactical adaptations, though Japanese warfare would remain focused on individual combat and cavalry actions for centuries to come. The aftermath of the Mongol invasions strained the Kamakura shogunate. Defending against the invasions was expensive, requiring constant military readiness and the construction of defensive fortifications. But there was no plunder to distribute as reward, since the invasions failed. Samurai who had fought expected compensation, but the government had little to give. This created resentment and financial strain that gradually undermined the shogunate's authority. Daily life for a samurai involved more than just warfare. In peacetime, which was actually the majority of the time, even during the Kamakura period, samurai served as local administrators and judges. They managed the estates granted to them, overseeing agricultural production and resolving disputes among farmers. They maintained order, serving as a combination of police and military force. They practiced their martial skills, training continuously because competence eroded quickly without practice. The relationship between samurai and the farmers who worked land under their control was complex. Farmers produced the food that sustained everyone. They paid taxes in rice that supported samurai and the larger political structure. Without farmers, the entire system would collapse. Samurai were supposed to provide protection and just governance in exchange for the rice they extracted. In theory, this was a mutually beneficial relationship. In practice, it was often exploitative, with samurai demanding as much as farmers could produce and using force to ensure compliance. Violence was never far from the surface in samurai society. Disputes over land, honor, or precedence could quickly escalate to armed conflict. The relatively long peace of the early Kamakura period gave way to increasing instability as the 13th century progressed. The 1221 Jokyu War, an attempt by the emperor to reassert authority against the shogunate, was brutally suppressed. The 1331 Genko War marked the beginning of chaos that would eventually lead to the Kamakura shogunate's fall and replacement by the Ashikaga shogunate in 1336. For common people, the rise of warrior rule meant living under the constant threat of violence. Samurai disputes might be resolved through small-scale battles that destroyed fields and villages. Bandits, often masterless samurai, preyed on travelers and isolated communities. The legal system, such as it was, offered limited protection for those without power or connections. If a samurai killed a commoner, even unjustly, there was little recourse. The warrior class lived by different rules, and those rules privileged their interests and prerogatives. Could you have survived in the world of the Kamakura period? Could you have endured the intensive training required to become a competent samurai? The physical conditioning alone, the hours of practice with bow and sword and horse, would be exhausting. The mental pressure, knowing that your skills might determine whether you live or die in combat, would be crushing. The violence, the need to kill face to face, would traumatize most modern people who have never experienced combat and who grew up in societies that condemn violence except in carefully circumscribed situations. And if you were not samurai but a common farmer, could you have lived under military rule, knowing that armed warriors could take what they wanted and you had no defense, no appeal, no protection? Could you have watched your rice harvest carried away to feed warriors while your own family went hungry? Could you have accepted the fundamental unfairness of a system where your value was measured only by your productivity and your life was worth nothing compared to a samurai's honor? The Kamakura period marked the beginning of Japan's warrior age, a transformation that would define Japanese history for centuries. The cultural achievements of this period, particularly in religious developments like Zen Buddhism and in new forms of art and literature, were significant. But underlying all of this was violence, the constant possibility that disagreements would be resolved through force. Living in such a society required a level of comfort with violence and death that most modern people do not possess. This is perhaps the fundamental challenge in imagining life in ancient Japan. Not just the physical hardships, the hunger and disease and exhausting labor, but the psychological reality of living in a world where violence is commonplace, where death is an ever-present possibility, where justice is the prerogative of those with power, rather than a universal right. We are products of a civilization that has worked, however imperfectly, to reduce violence and establish rule of law. The idea that might makes right, that the strong can do what they will to the weak, is morally repugnant to us. But this was simply reality in the Kamakura period, and for long afterward. Understanding this helps us appreciate how different ancient Japan truly was from our modern world. The spiritual and supernatural world. In ancient Japan, the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin and permeable. Spirits, or kami, inhabited mountains, rivers, ancient trees, and unusual rock formations. The spirits of ancestors watched over their descendants. Angry ghosts could torment the living. Demons and monsters lurked in dark forests and abandoned buildings. The supernatural was not metaphorical or symbolic. It was real. A daily consideration in how people understood and navigated their world. Shinto, the native Japanese spiritual tradition, though it would not be formalized under that name until much later, provided the fundamental framework for understanding spiritual reality. Everything in nature possessed a spiritual essence or force. Some natural features and phenomena housed particularly powerful kami. Mount Fuji, despite its volcanic temperament, was sacred, home to powerful deities. Waterfalls, where water cascaded with tremendous energy, were sites of spiritual power. Ancient trees that had survived for centuries clearly possessed vitality beyond that of ordinary plants, and were revered accordingly. The kami were not gods in the sense of being all-powerful beings who created and controlled the universe. They were powerful spirits intimately connected to specific places or phenomena. They were neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but rather possessed complex natures that included both beneficent and dangerous aspects. A river kami might provide fish and water for agriculture, supporting human life. The same kami, displeased by pollution or disrespect, might flood and destroy villages. Maintaining good relationships with kami required proper conduct and offerings. Shinto shrines marked sites of particular spiritual significance. These might be elaborate wooden structures, or simply sacred rocks or trees marked with rope and paper decorations. Individuals visited shrines to pray, to seek blessings, to give thanks, or to request intercession in solving problems. The ritual of approach was formalized, washing hands and mouth at a water basin to purify oneself, bowing before entering the shrine precincts, offering a coin or other gift, ringing a bell to attract the kami's attention, bowing again, and praying silently or aloud. Priests and shrine maidens served as intermediaries between humans and kami. They performed rituals to honor the kami, to ensure good harvests, to protect communities from disaster. Major shrines became wealthy and politically powerful institutions, granted control over land and resources. Smaller shrines served local communities, their priests often part-time positions held by community members who also farmed or pursued other occupations. Rituals marked every significant transition and activity. Before planting rice, rituals asked for the kami's blessing on the crop. During planting, prayers continued. At harvest, the first rice was offered to kami before any was consumed by humans. Birth, coming of age, marriage, death, all were marked by Shinto rituals. Seasonal festivals celebrated the turning of the year and maintained the community's relationship with spiritual forces. But alongside Shinto, Buddhism had become deeply embedded in Japanese culture by the time of the Heian period. Buddhism offered a philosophical and practical framework for understanding suffering, death, and the possibility of transcendence. It provided detailed cosmologies describing realms of existence beyond the visible world. It offered techniques for spiritual cultivation, meditation practices, ethical guidelines, and the promise of liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Different Buddhist sects emerged, each with distinctive practices and emphases. Pure Land Buddhism, which gained tremendous popularity during the Kamakura period, taught that salvation could be achieved through faith and the invocation of Amida Buddha's name. This simple practice was accessible to everyone, not just monks or scholars. You did not need to master complex philosophy or engage in difficult meditation practices. You simply needed to call upon Amida with sincere faith, and upon death, you would be reborn in the Pure Land, a paradise where enlightenment was easily achieved. This teaching offered tremendous comfort in a world where suffering was ubiquitous. The disasters, diseases, and hardships of earthly existence were temporary, merely one stage in an eternal journey. Death was not an ending, but a transition to a better realm. This belief helped people cope with losses that might otherwise have been psychologically overwhelming. When a child died, as so many did, the parents could believe that the child had been reborn in paradise. When disease ravaged a community, survivors could believe that the dead were now in a better place. Zen Buddhism, introduced during the Kamakura period, offered a very different path. Zen emphasized direct insight into one's true nature through meditation and paradoxical teaching methods. It rejected reliance on scripture or intellectual understanding, pointing instead to immediate experiential realization. Zen was particularly attractive to the samurai class because it offered a way to cultivate mental clarity, discipline, and fearlessness in the face of death. A samurai who had transcended attachment to life and death through Zen practice could face combat without the paralyzing fear that might cause hesitation or poor judgment. Other Buddhist sects focused on different practices and teachings. Tendai and Shingon esoteric Buddhism involved elaborate rituals and visualizations. Nichiren Buddhism emphasized the Lotus Sutra, and and developed a confrontational style that criticized other Buddhist sects as inadequate. Each sect claimed to offer the most effective path to liberation, and competition between them sometimes became heated, even violent. Buddhism and Shinto coexisted in complex ways. Rather than viewing them as separate, mutually exclusive religions, most Japanese people incorporated elements of both into their spiritual lives. Shinto rituals marked important life transitions and maintained relationships with local kami. Buddhist practices addressed questions of death, afterlife, and spiritual cultivation. Many shrines and temples were built in close proximity, sometimes sharing the same grounds. Kami was sometimes identified with Buddhist deities, creating syncretic blends where the boundary between Shinto and Buddhist became blurred. Common people's religious practice was pragmatic and eclectic. You prayed to Kami when you needed good weather for your crops. You made offerings at Buddhist temples when someone was sick. You participated in seasonal festivals because that was what your community did, and because failing to participate might offend spiritual forces. You probably did not spend much time contemplating the philosophical distinctions between different religious traditions. You simply did what seemed most likely to bring blessings and avoid misfortune. Fear of spiritual pollution, or kegare, significantly influenced behavior. Death was polluting. So was disease, blood, and childbirth. People who had been exposed to these pollutions were required to undergo purification rituals before participating in normal social activities or entering sacred spaces. This concept had practical effects on social organization. Those whose occupations dealt with death or blood, such as butchers, leatherworkers, and executioners, were considered spiritually polluted and were subject to social discrimination that lasted for centuries. Ghosts and vengeful spirits featured prominently in popular belief. When someone died under tragic or unjust circumstances, their spirit might remain in the world, seeking revenge or simply unable to find peace. Ghost stories told of wronged wives returning to haunt unfaithful husbands, of warriors killed in battle remaining at the site of their death, of murdered victims tormenting their killers. These were not entertaining fiction. People believed that ghosts were real and dangerous. Protection against malevolent spirits required various countermeasures. Amulets and charms purchased from temples and shrines provided spiritual protection. Certain rituals could ward off evil influences. Buddhist sutras could be chanted to pacify angry spirits. In extreme cases, exorcism rituals performed by specialist priests might be necessary to drive out a particularly powerful or persistent spirit. Divination practices helped people navigate uncertainty. Consulting fortune tellers or reading omens in natural phenomena provided guidance for important decisions. If you were unsure whether to marry a particular person, travel on a particular day, or pursue a particular course of action, divination might clarify the correct choice. Dreams were taken very seriously as messages from the spiritual realm, requiring interpretation by specialists. The supernatural explained what would otherwise be inexplicable. Why did that child die while this one survived? Because a malevolent spirit targeted the family, or because the family had offended Akami through some inadvertent disrespect? Why did the earthquake destroy one village but spare another? Because the destroyed village had accumulated spiritual pollution that attracted disaster. Why did the crops fail? Because proper rituals had not been performed, or because a vengeful ghost was cursing the land. This worldview, where spiritual forces constantly influenced physical reality, required vigilance. You had to be careful about where you went, what you said, how you conducted yourself, because any action might have spiritual consequences. Offending a spirit could bring disaster not just on you, but on your entire family or community. Maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual realm was not optional. It was essential for survival and prosperity. Could you function in a world where the supernatural was assumed to be real and actively influencing events? Could you take seriously the idea that spirits inhabited trees and rivers? Could you believe that your deceased ancestors were watching and judging your actions? Could you participate in rituals and practices that from a modern materialist perspective might seem like superstition? For most of us, probably not. We are trained to think scientifically, to seek natural explanations for phenomena, to dismiss supernatural claims as delusion or fraud. The idea that one should consult fortune tellers for important decisions seems foolish. The concept that purification rituals are necessary after exposure to death seems like unnecessary superstition. The belief in ghosts and demons seems like primitive irrationality. But this judgment reflects the biases of our own cultural moment. The people of ancient Japan were not stupid. They were responding rationally to the world as they understood it. They did not have germ theory to explain disease, so spiritual explanations made sense. They did not have seismology to explain earthquakes, so divine punishment or supernatural forces seemed plausible. They did not have psychology to explain mental illness or unusual experiences, so possession by spirits provided a framework for understanding. And perhaps more importantly, the spiritual framework provided comfort and meaning in a harsh world. When disaster struck, as it inevitably did, believing that it had spiritual causes meant that spiritual solutions might help. You could perform rituals, make offerings, seek protection from spiritual authorities. You could do something, even if that something was ultimately ineffective by modern understanding. The alternative, accepting that disasters were random, that you were helpless, that there was no meaning or justice to suffering, might have been psychologically unbearable. The supernatural world of ancient Japan was not separate from daily life. It was woven throughout every aspect of existence, providing explanations, demanding attention, offering both threats and promises. Living in that world required a kind of spiritual awareness that most modern people have lost. Whether you see that as a loss or as liberation from superstition depends on your perspective. But either way, It represents yet another profound difference between ancient Japan and our modern world. Social hierarchy and the impossibility of mobility. In ancient Japan, your birth determined your life. The family and class you were born into would dictate your occupation, your prospects, your opportunities, and your constraints for your entire existence. Social mobility, the idea that through talent or effort or luck you might rise above your origins, was not merely difficult, it was essentially impossible. The structure of society was seen not as arbitrary human construction, but as natural order, divinely ordained, the way things had always been and always would be. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the emperor. According to foundational mythology, the imperial line descended directly from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, making the emperor not just a political ruler, but a living deity, or at least the descendant of divinity. This gave the imperial institution tremendous symbolic power. The emperor was the high priest of Shinto, performing essential rituals that maintained cosmic order and ensured the well-being of the nation. Theoretically, the emperor was supreme, the source of all legitimate authority. But theory and practice diverged dramatically. By the Heian period, real political power had passed to regents from powerful aristocratic families, particularly the Fujiwara. These regents ruled in the emperor's name, while the emperor himself was often a child or youth, manipulated by more powerful figures. When the emperor matured enough to potentially assert independence, he might be encouraged or forced to abdicate in favor of a younger, more controllable successor. The emperor remained sacred and revered, but he rarely exercised actual governmental authority. Below the emperor were the court aristocrats, the kuge. These families claimed ancient lineage and held hereditary positions in the court bureaucracy. Their lives were the refined, cultured existence we explored earlier. They wrote poetry, performed ceremonies, served in nominal administrative roles, and lived off income from estates managed by others. Their power came from proximity to the emperor, from control of governmental institutions, and from the cultural capital that came with education and sophistication. Within the aristocracy itself, there were gradations of rank and status. Some families were more prestigious than others. Some positions carried more authority and income. Complex rules governed who could marry whom, what colors and patterns one could wear, what size of residence one could maintain. Your rank was visible in everything you did, every interaction governed by protocols of precedence and deference. To violate these protocols was to commit a social offense that could damage your family's standing for generations. With the rise of warrior rule, a new elite emerged: the samurai. Initially, samurai were provincial warriors employed by court nobles to protect their interests and enforce their authority in distant provinces. But over time, as military power became increasingly important, samurai rose in status and authority until they became the de facto ruling class. Yet even samurai society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the shogun and great lords, the daimyo, who controlled vast territories. Below them were layers of lesser samurai, each bound to superiors by obligations of loyalty and service. The relationship between lord and vassal was supposedly one of mutual obligation. The lord provided the vassal with land to control and the income it generated. In exchange, the vassal provided military service and loyalty. But this relationship was deeply asymmetrical. The vassal's entire livelihood depended on the lord's favor. A lord could strip a vassal of his position, confiscate his land, even order him to commit suicide, and the vassal was expected to obey. The lord's obligations were much less clearly defined and less reliably enforced. Below the warrior and noble classes were the vast majority of the population: farmers, artisans, and merchants. Farmers, despite being numerically dominant and economically essential, were low in official status. They were valued for their productivity, but also constrained by countless regulations controlling where they could live, what they could wear, what they could eat, even whether they could travel. They existed to produce rice that supported everyone above them. Their individual desires and welfare mattered little or not at all. Artisans, skilled craftspeople who produced tools, pottery, textiles, and other necessary goods, had somewhat higher status than farmers in some contexts, lower in others. Their skills gave them some degree of economic security and perhaps a bit more autonomy than farmers tied to the land. But they too were subject to extensive regulation and held a subordinate position in society's hierarchy. Merchants, who bought and sold goods rather than producing them, were theoretically the lowest of the respectable classes. This reflected Confucian philosophical traditions that valued production over trade and viewed merchants as parasites who contributed nothing while enriching themselves from others' work. In practice, successful merchants could accumulate significant wealth, and wealth brought a certain informal power, but they remained socially inferior, unable to purchase noble or samurai status, no matter how rich they became. Below even these groups were outcasts, people whose occupations or circumstances placed them beyond the pale of normal society. Those who worked with death, such as butchers, leather workers, and executioners, were considered spiritually polluted. Beggars, traveling entertainers, and others without fixed places in the social order were viewed with suspicion and contempt. These people were essential, their services necessary, but they were socially invisible, existing in a twilight zone outside the normal class structure. Women's status was determined entirely by the men they were related to. A woman's father, husband, or son determined her position in society. Women could not hold official positions, could not own property independently in most circumstances, could not make important decisions about their own lives. Elite women enjoyed material comfort and some degree of cultural respect as creators of literature and art, but they remained fundamentally powerless, confined to domestic spaces, their movements restricted, their voices heard only through male relatives or indirectly through written works. Childhood was not a recognized stage of life in the modern sense. Children were small adults expected to contribute to family survival as soon as they were physically capable. Peasant children worked in the fields. Artisan children learned their parents' trades. Samurai children trained in martial arts. Aristocratic children studied literature and ceremony. Childhood was preparation for adult roles, not a protected period of play and education. This rigid hierarchy was enforced through multiple mechanisms. Legal codes explicitly differentiated between classes, with different punishments for the same crime depending on the perpetrator's and victim's status. A samurai who killed a peasant might face no punishment at all, while a peasant who struck a samurai, even in self-defense, would be executed. Social customs and etiquette constantly reinforced status differences. The language itself had different levels of formality and respect, so every conversation encoded hierarchy in the very words used. The idea that one might change one's class was not just difficult, it was almost unthinkable. A farmer's child would be a farmer. An artisan's child would learn their parents' craft. A merchant's child would enter trade. A samurai's child would be a warrior. Deviation from this pattern was rare and usually required extraordinary circumstances like adoption by someone of higher status, itself rare and limited by strict rules. This lack of mobility was not seen as unjust. It was simply the natural order. You were born into a position that reflected your karma from previous lives. Your current circumstances were the result of past actions in this life and previous existences. Accept your fate, fulfill your assigned role, and perhaps in future lives you might be born into better circumstances. This Buddhist teaching, whatever spiritual value it might have, conveniently justified social inequality and discouraged rebellion. Could you accept living in a society where your birth determined everything, where no amount of talent or effort could elevate you beyond your ordained position? Could you watch others enjoy privileges and opportunities denied to you simply because of their bloodline? Could you raise children knowing they would inherit your limitations, that they were forever barred from certain paths regardless of their potential? For most modern people, raised with ideals of equality and meritocracy, this would be psychologically devastating. We believe, at least in principle, that people should be judged on their abilities and achievements rather than their ancestry. We believe that hard work should be rewarded, that talent should have opportunities, that circumstances of birth should not permanently determine life outcomes. These are deeply held values. In ancient Japan, these values did not exist. The social hierarchy was simply reality, as fixed and unchangeable as the progression of seasons. Those born into privilege rarely questioned whether they deserved their position. Those born into hardship rarely imagined their circumstances could be different. It was simply how the world worked. And this, perhaps as much as any physical hardship, is why we could not survive in ancient Japan. Not just because we would lack immunity to diseases or strength for labor, but because we would lack the psychological acceptance of injustice necessary to function in such a profoundly unequal society. We would be constantly angry, constantly frustrated, constantly aware of the unfairness, and that awareness would poison our existence in ways that would make survival, in any meaningful sense, impossible. Conclusion: honoring what we cannot endure. We have journeyed together through ancient Japan, from the prehistoric Jomon period through the emergence of rice agriculture, the refined courts of Heian, and into the warrior age of Kamakura. We have examined disease and medicine, food and famine, bathing and sanitation, spiritual beliefs and social hierarchies. Through it all, a single truth has emerged. You would not have survived. Neither would I. This is not a judgment on our individual weakness. It is a recognition that we are products of our time, shaped by modern advantages we rarely even recognize as advantages because they seem normal to us. Medical care that can cure bacterial infections with a simple pill. Food systems that ensure most people in developed nations never experience real hunger. Sanitation infrastructure that makes clean water and waste disposal invisible and automatic. Individual rights and at least theoretical equality before the law. These are not universal human experiences. They are recent achievements, hard-won through centuries of technological development, political struggle, and social evolution. The people of ancient Japan did not have these advantages. They lived with chronic disease, inadequate nutrition, primitive sanitation, rigid hierarchies, and the constant threat of natural disasters that could destroy everything in moments. They survived not because they were superhuman, but because they had no alternative. They developed resilience, the only kind they could develop, resilience born of necessity and acceptance. They found meaning and beauty in their circumstances, creating art and literature and spiritual practices that still move us today. But we must not romanticize their suffering. The fact that they endured does not mean their suffering was acceptable or that we should minimize it. The beauty of Heian court poetry does not erase the brutal poverty of the peasants whose labor made that court culture possible. The sophistication of Buddhist philosophy does not heal the children who died from preventable diseases. The refinement of Japanese aesthetics does not fill the bellies of those who went hungry. Appreciating ancient Japanese culture requires holding both truths simultaneously, recognizing the extraordinary achievements while acknowledging the terrible costs. This journey through ancient Japan should leave us with several important realizations. First, humility. Our modern world, for all its problems, represents improvements over the past that we often fail to appreciate. Second, gratitude. We are privileged to live in a time and place where most people can expect to live long lives, where medical care is available, where food is abundant, where individual autonomy is valued. Third, responsibility. These advantages were not inevitable. They required effort from countless people across generations. Maintaining and extending them requires our continued effort. It should also give us perspective on our own complaints. The inconveniences we experience, the frustrations of modern life, these are real and worth addressing. But they exist in a context of privilege that most humans throughout history could not imagine. When we complain about minor discomforts, we might remember that our ancestors would have given anything for the problems we have rather than the problems they faced. Finally, this journey should instill respect. The people of ancient Japan were not primitive or simple. They were complex individuals with rich inner lives, facing challenges that would crush most of us, and they persevered. They loved their children, mourned their losses, found joy in cherry blossoms and poetry, and maintained hope even when circumstances seemed hopeless. They were human, fully human, living human lives with all the dignity that entails. They deserve our honor and our remembrance. So here we are, at the end of our journey. We have seen ancient Japan in all its beauty and brutality, its refinement and its harshness. We have understood, I hope, why we could not have lasted a day in that world. But understanding this does not diminish ancient Japan. If anything, it makes the achievements of that culture more remarkable, the resilience of those people more worthy of admiration. If you have found value in this exploration of history, if this has given you new perspective on the past and the present, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more journeys we can take together through history, many more worlds to explore, many more lessons to learn from our ancestors' experiences. Thank you for listening. Rest well, and remember, the difficulties of the past help us appreciate the possibilities of the present.